I'm Yascha Mounk. I'm a professor of the practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University, the host of a Good Fight podcast, and the founder of Persuasion. My latest book is called The Identity Trap, a story of ideas and power in our time. It tries to explain and critique the new set of ideas about race and gender and sexual orientation that have become really influential over the course of the last decades. But my previous book, the book before that, was called The Great Experiment, How Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. In this book I start with a simple realization, which is that we have not historically had deeply diverse, deeply ethnically and religiously diverse democracies that undertake, that attempt to treat everybody as equals. We had relatively homogeneous societies that treated people as equals, or deeply diverse societies like in the history of the United States, but often explicitly and openly treated some people as second-class citizens or worse. And what we're trying to do now in Western Europe, in North America, in Australia, and parts of Asia and Latin America is therefore something quite new, building these diverse democracies that actually treat people as equals. In The Great Experiment, I try to think about what it would take to succeed in this endeavor and how we're doing at that. And I start with the worrying realization that diverse democracies have often fallen apart in terrible ways, that they've suffered from bad forms of domination in which one group ruled over the others, but they fragmented in ways that led to civic strife or sometimes civil war, or that they simply weren't able to get state institutions off the ground in the first place and were unable to provide basic public goods like streets or hospitals and so on. So what we're trying to do is very difficult, and if we fail in this undertaking, the price may be ethnic cleansing or genocide, maybe war or civil war, maybe terrible suffering. But when we measure where we've gotten to by those historical standards, when we actually understand the broader context of how new and difficult what we're trying to do is, then I think we can become much more optimistic about the extent to which we have succeeded so far. Despite real injustices that remain, our societies are much more just, are much more thriving, are much more prosperous than many people realize and recognize. Attitudes of most citizens in the United States and beyond have become vastly more tolerant over the course of the last decades. Just think of the fact that within my own lifetime, somebody like Ellen DeGeneres had to drop out of her sitcom, was fired essentially from her sitcom for publicly acknowledging that she had a girlfriend. Or think about the fact that in the 1960s, only about 5% of Americans thought that interracial marriage was morally acceptable, whereas today that number is up to 95%. Today it's only 5%, less than 5% of Americans who think that interracial marriage is not acceptable. And we know that this isn't just how people respond to opinion polls, there's been an actual change in behavior. The number of interracial babies has increased 5 or 6-fold over the course of the last decades. We're also often too pessimistic about how immigrants are doing in our societies. The right or the far right often tends to claim that immigrants do badly because there's supposedly something inferior about them, and that explains why they have terrible socioeconomic outcomes. The left and much of the mainstream disagrees rightly with that description of the reasons, but agrees with the diagnosis, says that it's because of racism and other forms of discrimination that immigrants can't succeed. Well, actually, the best studies we have, both about Europe and about North America, show that immigrants do remarkably well. That in the United States, for example, immigrants that have come to us in the last years and decades from El Salvador or Vietnam or Nigeria or other parts of the world do about as well as Italian and Irish immigrants did a century ago. The process of integration, the process of socioeconomic mobility takes time. It often takes a few generations, but it is proceeding at the same pace as it ever has in American history. And so I think when you recognize a form of hard-won optimism, which is aware of the stakes of failure, which is conscious of the injustices that persist, but is also able to pay attention to some of the progress that we have been able to make, then you come to have a much more positive view of where we are going. I think if you defend the basic values of our political system, the combination of individual freedom and collective self-determination that characterizes liberal democracies like the United States. If you embrace an inclusive form of patriotism, which celebrates what we have in common based on our mutual commitment to things like the United States Constitution, but also on the lived everyday culture that bears the influence of so many people around the world. If you accept a model for how we're going to interact that isn't asking as much for as much homogeneity as a melting pot, but nor is it accepting a vision sometimes called a mosaic or a salad bowl, where we barely have anything in common and just live next door to each other. If we think of our future as being modeled on that of a public park in which we can choose to stay among our own people, but a lot of the time we will enter into conversation with each other, we will make new friends, we will come to embark on a more genuinely shared life. If you do all of that, then I do think we have some of the basic norms and practices and ideals to make the great experiment succeed, to ensure that this very difficult challenge of building thriving democracies that are deeply ethnically and religiously diverse and that do treat all of the members as genuine equal is going to be a success.